The air inside the Montgomery County Courthouse in Birmingham, Alabama felt thick, not from the humidity outside, but from something heavier and unspoken truth that had settled into the walls over 2 decades. Anyone who walked through those heavy oak doors knew how things worked inside Judge Eleanor Hastings' courtroom. She wasn't just a judge, she was the law. For 24 years, Hastings ruled from the bench with an iron grip, her cold, cutting gaze peering over her reading glasses at every attorney who dared step before her. She never needed to raise her voice. Her authority was in her stare, in her dismissive wave of the hand, in the way she reduced seasoned lawyers to nervous amateurs. Some whispered that her rulings had a pattern, one that couldn't be proven but was obvious to those who had faced her. Black defendants rarely walked free in her courtroom, and black attorneys rarely won against her favored prosecutors. And today, that pattern was about to be tested. Isaiah Carter strode into the courtroom, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. He had stood in this room before many times, but today was different. Today, he wasn't just another defense attorney standing before Judge Hastings. He wasn't just another name on the docket. Today, he had something she didn't see coming. Isaiah was 48 years old, a legal powerhouse known for taking cases no one else dared touch. His reputation stretched beyond Alabama, and his ability to dismantle a prosecution's case made him a target for judges like Hastings. But that had never stopped him before, and it sure as hell wouldn't stop him today. He felt her eyes on him the moment he walked to the defense table. She already hated him, not because of the case, not because of anything he had said, but because of who he was. Isaiah set his briefcase down, steadying himself as he turned to his client, Jamal Benson, a 29-year-old man falsely accused of armed robbery. Jamal sat hunched, hands folded, shoulders tense, a man who had spent too long in the system, who had seen too much, lost too much. Judge Hastings barely acknowledged Isaiah as she scanned the paperwork in front of her. "Mr. Carter," she said in that same dry tone she reserved for defense attorneys she had no patience for. "You're already on thin ice in my courtroom. Don't waste my time today." There was no reason for her to say that. The trial hadn't even started. Isaiah tightened his grip on his briefcase but kept his face unreadable. "I'll try not to, Your Honor." She smirked. "Good. Because I have a full docket, and I don't need theatrics." She turned to the prosecution, Nathan Reynolds, an ambitious assistant district attorney barely 5 years out of years. The kind of prosecutor who tried too hard to impress the wrong people. "The state is ready, Your Honor," Reynolds said, casting a smug glance at Isaiah. Of course they were ready. They were always ready when the case was stacked against a black man. Isaiah leaned slightly toward Jamal. "We're ready too," he said, loud enough for the whole courtroom to hear. The trial began, but it wasn't a trial, it was a performance. And Judge Hastings was the star. Every objection Isaiah raised was dismissed before he could even finish speaking. Every time Reynolds stumbled, she guided him like a professor coaching her favorite student. The jury noticed. The gallery noticed. But no one was brave enough to say anything. Except Isaiah. He studied her, watched the way her lips curled when he spoke, the way she barely concealed her contempt. This wasn't just bias, it was something worse. He had been in hostile courtrooms before, but this was different. Judge Hastings wasn't even trying to hide it. Every time he spoke, she cut him off. Every time he raised a valid argument, she waved it away like a fly buzzing near her ear. The courtroom had its own rhythm. Lawyers spoke, judges ruled, the jury listened. But in this courtroom, Hastings had decided the verdict before the trial even began. Isaiah caught the jury's discomfort in the way they shifted in their seats. Even some of the white jurors, who might have entered with their own preconceived notions, couldn't ignore what was happening. But Hastings didn't care. She doubled down, her words sharper each time she addressed him. "Mr. Carter, you're testing my patience. Mr. Carter, if you raise one more baseless objection, I'll hold you in contempt. Mr. Carter, this is not a lecture hall. If you want a grandstand, do it somewhere else." Isaiah kept his face calm, but inside his blood was boiling. Not because she was insulting him, he could handle that, but because she was making it personal. And that was her mistake. Still, he needed her to keep talking, to keep exposing herself. "Your Honor," he said. His voice measured. The prosecution just introduced evidence that was not disclosed in discovery. "That's a clear violation of Brady v. Maryland. I move for an immediate mistrial." Judge Hastings leaned back in her chair, adjusting her glasses with exaggerated boredom. "Denied." Isaiah blinked. Not out of surprise, but out of strategy. He let a bead of silence hang in the air before speaking again. To be clear, Your Honor, you're refusing to acknowledge a Brady violation. Hastings' lips pursed in irritation. I said denied, Mr. Carter. Isaiah could feel the shift in the room. The reporters in the gallery scribbled faster. The whispers among the audience grew louder. She saw it too. Her eyes darkened, and for the first time she looked directly at him. You are dangerously close to being held in contempt, Mr. Carter. Isaiah tilted his head slightly. For what, Your Honor? Asking the court to follow the law? Hastings slammed her gavel so hard the sound echoed against the high ceilings. That's enough, she snapped. One more word, and I'll have you removed. The room fell into dead silence. Isaiah could hear his own heartbeat, but he wasn't nervous. This was exactly what he needed. Jamal clenched his fists under the table. Man, don't let her do this to you, he muttered, voice barely above a whisper. Isaiah didn't even glance over. I have nothing further, Your Honor, he said smoothly, taking his seat. Hastings scoffed, acting as if she had won. But what she didn't realize was that the game had just begun, and she had just played right into his hands. The jury exchanged looks, some glancing toward the gallery where reporters' pens scratched against their notepads. Everyone felt it now. The shift, the discomfort, the exposure. Judge Hastings sat straighter in her chair, her voice cold. Mr. Reynolds, continue with your questioning. Nathan Reynolds cleared his throat, clearly rattled. He was young, but he wasn't stupid. He saw what was happening too. Yes, Your Honor. He turned to the witness stand where a nervous store clerk sat. And that's when the double doors of the courtroom swung open. 2 federal agents in dark suits strode in. The room went still. A silence so deep it swallowed the air itself. And Judge Eleanor Hastings finally looked afraid. The heavy double doors of the courtroom swung open, their sudden movement pulling every gaze away from the witness stand. 2 federal agents in dark suits strode in, their steps crisp, calculated, commanding attention. A hush fell over the room, thick with confusion and unease, as if the very walls of the courthouse sensed something monumental was about to happen. Even the sound of a reporter's pen scratching against paper came to an abrupt stop. Isaiah Carter remained seated, smoothing his tie with a slow, deliberate motion. He had been waiting for this moment, had spent years preparing for it, and now it was unfolding exactly as he had planned. Judge Eleanor Hastings, who had ruled this courtroom with unshakable authority, was about to find out what it meant to be powerless. Isaiah folded his hands neatly on the defense table and watched. Hastings' face remained unreadable at first, her cold stare darting between the agents as if trying to assess whether they were a threat or a nuisance. The jury exchanged nervous glances, their eyes shifting between the agents and the judge, unsure what to make of the disruption. Nathan Reynolds, the young prosecutor who had spent the trial basking in Hastings' favoritism, suddenly looked uneasy, as though realizing his safety net had just been yanked away. The gallery, once lulled into silence by the judge's oppressive presence, now pulsed with anticipation. One of the agents, a tall man with a clipped demeanor, stepped forward and pulled a document from his jacket. Judge Eleanor Hastings, he said, his voice measured but unyielding. We need to speak with you immediately. Hastings' fingers curled against the bench, the first visible sign of tension. I am in the middle of a trial, she replied sharply, her voice edged with irritation. Whatever this is, it can wait until proceedings are concluded. The agent didn't so much as blink. It cannot. His words landed like a hammer, heavy and absolute, stripping her of any authority she thought she had. For the first time in her 24 years on the bench, Eleanor Hastings was not in control. The tension in the room thickened, pressing against the chests of everyone present. Even the jury, who had been carefully trained to remain impartial, sat on the edge of their seats. Isaiah saw the slight tremor in Hastings' hand as she adjusted her glasses, the tiny fracture in her composure that no one else might have noticed. But he noticed everything. Nathan Reynolds cleared his throat, attempting to reassert some semblance of normalcy. Should we take a recess, Your Honor? His voice wavered slightly, betraying his uncertainty. Hastings didn't answer right away, and that hesitation was louder than any outburst could have been. Then, as if realizing how weak she must look, she straightened her shoulders and shook her head. No, she said, forcing steel into her voice. We are not taking a recess. The defense has wasted enough of this court's time, and I refuse to. She never got to finish. The second agent stepped forward, a folded sheet of paper in his hand. His voice rang through the courtroom, calm but firm, cutting through the thick air like a blade. Judge Eleanor Hastings, you are under arrest. The room erupted. A gasp rippled through the jury box, the gallery, the court officers who had worked under her for years. Even those who had seen her wield unchecked power in trial after trial sat in stunned silence, as if struggling to process the reality of what they had just heard. Isaiah didn't react, didn't move, didn't let so much as a twitch betray what he felt inside. This was the moment he had orchestrated, the inevitable consequence of Hastings' arrogance and corruption finally catching up to her. He kept his face calm, but inside he let himself savor the shift in power. She had spent decades crushing people under the weight of the law. Now, the law had turned on her. Hastings' lips barely moved as she spoke, her voice low and controlled. On what charges? But Isaiah saw then something no one else had ever seen in her before. Fear. The lead agent unfolded the warrant and read aloud. You are being arrested under suspicion of bribery, obstruction of justice, abuse of judicial power, and multiple violations of civil rights under federal law. Each word hung in the air like a nail in her coffin. The courtroom, once a place where she ruled with an iron grip, had become the stage of her downfall. The jury, sworn to remain neutral, could no longer conceal their emotions. Some of them looked stunned, others exchanged uneasy glances, and a few sat stone-faced, as if unwilling to process what was happening before their eyes. The reporters in the gallery scrambled to take notes, their pens moving frantically, knowing they were witnessing a story that would shake the legal world. For the first time, Hastings had no control over the room. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The gavel that she had slammed countless times now sat useless before her, a symbol of power that no longer belonged to her. Isaiah rose to his feet, his movements precise, intentional, unhurried. He buttoned his suit jacket, letting the silence stretch before he finally spoke. Your Honor, he said, his voice deceptively calm, I believe you just denied my motion for a mistrial. But it seems this trial is now the least of your concerns. Hastings' jaw clenched, her nostrils flaring, her pride warring against reality. But no amount of defiance could change the fact that she was now the accused, standing before the same justice system she had manipulated for years. The irony was poetic. The lead agent took a step forward. Judge Hastings, please stand. A long moment passed, the weight of the moment pressing down on her like an unseen force. Then, finally, she pushed herself up from the bench, though she moved with reluctance, as if each motion drained her of the power she once wielded so effortlessly. The agent stepped behind her, and with a swift practiced motion, he locked the handcuffs around her wrists. The click of metal rang through the silent courtroom, a sound more deafening than any gavel strike. The gallery buzzed with murmurs, the energy in the room shifting, the tides of power turning in real time. Hastings' face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line, but she refused to look at anyone. The woman who had once reduced men to nothing with a single glance now stared at the floor, avoiding the reality unfolding around her. One of the court officers, a man who had worked under her for years, stepped forward to open the doors. He didn't bow his head, didn't avert his gaze, he simply held the door wide, as if inviting her to step into the very system she had twisted for so long. Hastings hesitated for the briefest of moments, then stepped through. And just like that, she was gone. The weight of her departure left the courtroom in stunned silence. The walls, once suffocating under her dominance, seemed lighter, as if the room itself had exhaled a breath it had been holding for 24 years. The reporters whispered furiously, already piecing together their headlines. The jury sat motionless, as if still trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. Isaiah let out a slow breath, his focus shifting back to the reason he had come here in the first place. Jamal Benson was still in handcuffs. Hastings was gone, but the stain of her rulings remained, the echoes of her injustices still clinging to the cases she had controlled. Isaiah turned to the new judge, an older black man with a reputation for fairness, now seated in Hastings' place. He adjusted his tie, squared his shoulders, and spoke with quiet authority. Your Honor, given recent developments, I move for an immediate dismissal of all charges against my client. The judge leaned back slightly, studying Isaiah with the patience of a man who had seen far too many trials poisoned by corruption. He let the silence stretch, then nodded. I agree. The charges against Mr. Benson are dismissed. Bailiff, remove his restraints. A beat of silence. Then the cuffs fell away. Jamal exhaled, his body visibly relaxing for the first time since the trial began. Isaiah placed a firm hand on his shoulder, a silent reassurance. "You're free," he said. But deep down, Isaiah knew this fight wasn't over. Jamal Benson stood still for a moment, staring down at his wrist where the handcuffs had just been removed. It was as if he couldn't believe it was real. That after everything, the weight of injustice had finally been lifted. His breath came out slow and shaky, his fingers flexing like they were feeling freedom for the first time. Isaiah Carter watched him closely, waiting for the reality to sink in. The gallery murmured, the tension in the room shifting from shock to relief, but also curiosity what would happen next. Judge Hastings was gone, let out of the courtroom handcuffs, but the damage she had done was still here, woven into the very fabric of the justice system she had controlled for decades. Isaiah turned his gaze toward the new judge, the man who had stepped in to oversee what was left of the trial. The courtroom wasn't the same, but the fight wasn't over. Nathan Reynolds, the young prosecutor who had stood so confidently at the beginning of the trial, looked lost. His entire strategy had crumbled in front of him, his mentor and protector removed from power in the most public way possible. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but quickly shut it again, knowing there was nothing he could say that would salvage his disaster. Isaiah buttoned his suit jacket, stepping forward with the calm confidence of a man who had just won, not just a case, but a battle much larger than this one. He turned to face the new judge, his voice measured but firm. "Your Honor, while the charges against my client have been dismissed, I cannot ignore the broader implications of what happened in this courtroom today." The judge nodded slightly, waiting for him to continue. "This isn't just about one case," Isaiah said, his words directed not just at the judge, but at the jury, the reporters, the world watching. "This is about every man and woman who stood in front of Judge Hastings and never had the chance to fight back. Every defendant who was denied a fair trial. Every life she ruined because she thought she was untouchable." A murmur rippled through the gallery, people shifting in their seats, some nodding in agreement. The reporters' pens flew across their notepads, capturing every word. Isaiah knew this wasn't just about Jamal. It was bigger. The judge leaned forward, his fingers laced together. "Mr. Carter, are you making a formal request?" Isaiah met his gaze, unflinching. "Yes, Your Honor. I am formally requesting a review of every case Judge Hastings has presided over in the last 24 years. A wave of gasps spread through the courtroom. Even Jamal, still processing his own freedom, turned to Isaiah with wide eyes. The request wasn't just bold, it was historic. Nathan Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, his face pale. "Your Honor," he stammered, scrambling for anything to push back against Isaiah's move. "This is highly unusual." The judge raised an eyebrow. "So is the arrest of a sitting judge in the middle of a trial, Mr. Reynolds." A single beat of silence, then the judge nodded. "Request granted. I will be issuing an immediate judicial review of all cases overseen by Judge Hastings, effective today." The room exploded into whispers, the magnitude of the decision hitting like a shockwave. Isaiah remained composed, but inside he knew what this meant. This wasn't just a victory, it was a reckoning. The reporters rushed to the door, eager to be the first to break the news. The jury sat motionless, their duty finished, but their perspective forever changed. And Jamal, still standing beside Isaiah, finally let out a soft, disbelieving laugh. "Man," he whispered, shaking his head. "I thought people like her never got what was coming." Isaiah looked at him, his expression unreadable. "They do," he said quietly. "Sometimes it just takes too damn long." The fallout came fast and hard. By that evening, news outlets across the country ran the story. "Corrupt judge arrested in her own courtroom." One headline read. Another simply stated, "Justice finally comes to Montgomery County." Social media erupted with discussions, debates, and testimonies from former defendants who had suffered under Hastings' rule. In the days that followed, lawyers came forward, families spoke out, and an avalanche of appeals flooded the courts. The review of Hastings' cases was officially underway, and early reports suggested that dozens, if not hundreds, of convictions might be overturned. At the heart of it all was Isaiah Carter, the man who had pulled the strings behind Hastings' downfall. He had waited, planned, and executed his case with precision, and now he wasn't done, not even close. A week after the trial, Isaiah stood outside his office, staring at the city skyline as the sun set. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out, glancing at the name on the screen. Eleanor Hastings. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. But then, curiosity won. He answered. "Judge Hastings," he said, his voice unreadable. There was a long silence on the other end before she finally spoke. "You ruined me." Isaiah didn't blink. "No," he said evenly. You did that to yourself. Another pause. You think you won? Her voice was brittle, cracking under the weight of her own downfall. You think this changes anything? Isaiah let out a slow breath. I know it does. He waited a beat, then added, and you're not the last. The line went dead. Isaiah lowered his phone, staring out at the city. Hastings had fallen, but there were others like her, still holding power, still twisting the law to serve their own agendas. And he's just getting started. 2 months later, the first conviction tied to Hastings' courtroom was overturned. A man who had spent 15 years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit walked free, tears streaming down his face as reporters captured the moment. The governor announced a statewide audit of judicial corruption, and whispers spread that more arrests were coming. Jamal Benson sat across from Isaiah in his office, flipping through a newspaper with Hastings' face plastered on the front page. Man, this is crazy, he said, shaking his head. I don't even know how to thank you. Isaiah leaned back in his chair, watching him. Live your life, he said simply. That's thanks enough. Jamal nodded, setting the paper down. He stood, shaking Isaiah's hand with a grip full of gratitude, full of freedom. You ever need anything? Man, you call me. Isaiah smirked. I'll hold you to that. As Jamal left, Isaiah sat alone for a moment, letting himself breathe. Then, with quiet purpose, he reached for his next case file. Because somewhere in another courtroom, another Hastings was sitting on the bench, thinking they were untouchable, and Isaiah Carter was going to prove them wrong. The fall of Judge Eleanor Hastings is more than just a courtroom drama. It's a lesson about power, justice, and the courage to stand against corruption. For 24 years, Hastings sat on the bench, believing she was untouchable, believing the system would always protect her. But here's the truth. No one is above justice, and no abuse of power lasts forever. Isaiah Carter didn't win because he was lucky. He won because he refused to stay silent. He knew the fight would be long. The system would resist and the odds would be stacked against him. But he pushed forward anyway. He didn't let fear stop him. He didn't let doubt slow him down. And in the end, justice wasn't just served, it was reclaimed. This is your reminder. The world doesn't change on its own. It takes people willing to speak up, to expose the truth, to challenge those who think they can get away with wrongdoing. It takes resilience. It takes patience. It takes action. If you see injustice, don't just look away. Don't just accept it. Stand up, fight back, and be the reason corruption falls. Because when one person has the courage to act, the whole system starts to shake.